if there's an issue with the sound, sometimes when we record, there's an issue with the sound. Oh, thank you, Judi. Hello. Welcome to our class.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to see both of you. Are you comfortable with us recording this class?
With recording it?
Mm-hmm.
Afterward, if I don't screw up, then I'm comfortable.
Okay, so we're gonna record it, but then maybe it'll go in the garbage. We'll decide later.
No, as a matter of fact, if it's recorded, I think Tannenbaum would be interested in seeing it because they might want to take a little, 30-second bit out of it in terms of organizational identification.
Wonderful. Maybe you could tell the students when you introduce yourself what the Tannenbaum organization is, because they know about you and they've read your writings, but we haven't talked about the organization. I don't want to take
a few words, right? Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to take too much time here introducing.
No, I don't either.
No, you should introduce yourselves. My students know both of your work. They know that you're legends and pioneers and revolutionaries in the history. I'm not being hyperbolic. In the history of Catholic Jewish relations after Nostra Aetate. It's a huge, huge honor that both of you have taken the time to speak to us today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I know that the students appreciate it. And I think we're going to start with asking both of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into this work in whatever format you want, whatever you're comfortable with. And then after we do that, maybe we'll look at some questions that the students had, but let's see how things go and play this a little bit by ear, if that's okay. Okay.
Go ahead, Judi.
Hi, John. How you doing?
Good.
Good. Yeah, I'm stuck. I'm not doing too well. I'm having a lot of trouble walking, and I'm going in for hip replacement.
Oh, geez.
Oh no. Well, if you're comfortable with it, Judi, do you want to begin with your introduction and tell us about yourself?
Yeah. Do you want me to start or John, Father John?
Judi, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. Right now? Okay. Okay, my name is Judi Banki, and my maiden name was Hirschkopf, and I wrote a number of articles under my maiden name before I got married. So some of them I believe the class has read. And my exact title is Senior Advisor for Interreligious Affairs for the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. And the Tannenbaum Center was, the namesake is Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, who was one of the leaders of the organized Jewish community in terms of reaching out and establishing dialogue and relationships with the Roman Catholic Church and with world Protestant bodies, World Council of Churches. And Mark died unexpectedly as the result of an operation. After, the joke, the operation was successful, but the patient died. He had heart surgery and died very shortly after that. And his widow, a very distinguished person in her own right, Dr. Georgette Bennett, set up a center, something to keep his public memory alive, because she gave birth to their son 7 weeks after he died, and she wanted to have something in place that he would know about his father and his father's accomplishments. The Tannenbaum Center has morphed a good deal since then. I'm the only one still there doing this kind of theological exploration, but the Tannenbaum Center is, interestingly, a secular multi-faith organization, multi-faith in terms of staff and outlook. which works to combat religious prejudice and hostility, and has several programs, one of which is religion and conflict resolution, where they give awards to people who, living in situations of armed conflict, reach out based on, motivated by religion, to somebody on the other side to try to establish dialogue. And one of them has to do with religion in the workplace, and one of them has to do with various education problems, and with religion in the role of religion, and also religious discrimination in the delivery of healthcare services. So those are the major programs of the Tannenbaum Center. And I'm the one that maintains the relationship with Christian bodies, with the International Council of Christians and Jews, with the CCJR, that is in the United States, which is the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations, which is an academic umbrella organization for all of the universities and other institutions doing the work of Christian-Jewish dialogue. Okay, John, it's for you.
Well, good afternoon. I'm happy to be with all of you. My journey actually began in this area when I was still in the seminary. I was in my final years of theology at the time, and of course, it was the period of the Second Vatican Council. And one professor in particular had a significant impact on me in terms of future involvement in Christian-Jewish relations. And that was a biblical scholar known as John Dominic Crossan. He's still out there doing some work, but John Dominic Crossan at the time was a member of my own religious order. And he actually wrote the very first kind of theological analysis of the Christian-Jewish relationship in the light of Nostra Aetate, chapter 4. And he presented that as a lecture. I think it was a matter of about 2 weeks after the close of the council. So it would have been in November of 1965. When I went to the University of Chicago for my doctoral work, I came under the sway of a couple other professors who really also aided and abetted my involvement in Christian-Jewish relations. One is very well known, the other much less known, but he was very much of a pioneer in early Christian-Jewish relations. His name was J. Kurt Reilersdam. He's deceased for quite a number of years now. He never wrote all that much. He wrote a few articles, but he had been a missionary in the Middle East. And when he came to the University of Chicago Divinity School, he maintained an interest in interreligious dialogue, but it was a special focus since he taught Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures at the Divinity School, with a special interest in the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And he kind of took me under his wing in terms of that area. And we actually remained friends well after I graduated and continued to have very pleasant lunches in Hyde Park for a number of years. The other person is much more well known, and that is the church historian, Dr. Martin Marty. He was interested more in the present day contemporary relationship between Jews and Christians, and encouraged me to pursue this area of study. And therefore, I did a number of papers for him in his courses that covered this particular area. Soon after ordination, actually, I came into contact with one Judith Banki because I was asked to come to New York by Rabbi Mark Tenenbaum, who was already mentioned, whom I might add was the only official Jewish peritus, if you want, at the Second Vatican Council. There were some other Jews involved with the process, but he had a kind of official status as the Jewish peritus, along with a number of Protestant Orthodox Christians and so on. He asked me to consider taking on a project, and the project had to do with a tri-faith study that Judi Banki had a lot to do with. A study of how the textbooks of the Protestant community, Catholic community, and Jewish communities portrayed various religious and racial outgroups. In the case of Christians, and especially Catholic Christians, the study was done at St. Louis University. And there were three parts to the study, one on literature text, one on social studies text, and one on religious text. The literature study was the first one, and it was kind of less sophisticated methodologically. The social studies and religion studies were done by two Catholic sisters working for their PhDs in education at St. Louis University under the direction of Father Trafford Maher. The studies that were produced were very technical and had a lot of educational jargon in them. And so Rabbi Tenenbaum was particularly interested in having the results of the religion studies, which were very controversial when they came out, because they really did describe areas of real prejudice with respect to the image of the Jews and the image of some other groups too, Muslims, etc., in these official Catholic textbooks. And the studies were done on the most widely used textbooks at the time in Catholic schools and Catholic educational programs, so that no one could say, well, these were just fringe textbooks. They were the most widely used. And Rabbi Tenenbaum was interested in making sure that ordinary teachers and others might benefit from these studies and so on, but they probably are not going to read the actual dissertations, which, as I say, were technical and at times full of educational jargon. So he said, would you produce a book kind of summarizing and critiquing to some extent the results of the studies, and we can put some of the official data at the back of the book. And this occurred, and Judi Banki was assigned to assist me in this project because she was really deeply involved with this whole textbook analysis project, which had been funded by the Ford Foundation. So my time with Judi Banki goes all the way back to then. And the book came out called Catechetics and Prejudice. But before the study was actually completed, the American Jewish Committee, through Rabbi Tenenbaum, brought the results of this study to the Second Vatican Council and showed it particularly to many of the bishops from the United States with the idea that this would encourage them to support the proposed document that was under discussion, Nostra Aetate, when it came down to a vote. And that was very important because the American bishops really strongly supported what is eventually Nostra Aetate, but especially Chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate, which deals with the Catholic-Jewish relationship. So those studies really played a significant role. And the American Jewish Committee, through Rabbi Tenenbaum, but with Judi Banki, definitely in a background position, but a very significant background position, played a singular role in really the formulation of Nostra Aetate and so on. And we always need to, if she is very much of a legend whose work was often unappreciated in terms of herself, because it really fed into what Rabbi Tenenbaum was contributing to the council. So from there on, one thing frankly led to another, and under the tutelage of Dr. Reilersdam and Dr. Marty at the University of Chicago, this became a central focus of my own education, actually as a social ethicist, which is my degree from the University of Chicago. And of course, it was the fact that it was focused on prejudice was very much of a link between the study of Christian-Jewish relations and social ethics. So I think I'll leave it at there. That's really the beginnings of my own involvement in this area, and I look forward to our further discussion.
Thank you. Can I ask Judi, would you mind telling us a little bit more about your background and how you came to be so involved in Catholic Jewish relations?
Well, I do want to tell how I got involved in this work, because it's serendipitous and it's also kind of funny. And I got into it 10 years before the Second Vatican Council. In 1955, I went up to the Anti-Defamation League at that time for an open position in the publications department. And, I was doing writing and editing and pamphlets and, whatever, the kind of studies that the ADL did. And I know for your generation and for students in general, this is hard to believe, but this time was pre-computers. There was no desktop publishing. And if you wanted to publish a pamphlet, you had to go to a print house, have galleys done, make your corrections on the galleries, had first proof, a second proof, a final proof, And so I was interviewed for this position by the newly arrived director of the publications department at ADL. And he said, you have the background in writing and in editing, copy editing, but I need somebody who's familiar with the print houses in New York, And I was not, and I was very honest about it. So he said, but there's another job opening here that requires some writing and editing ability as well. He said, and I'd like you to bring you over and introduce you to the rabbi. So when he said rabbi, the hair on the back of my neck, I didn't think I wanted to work with a rabbi. I had a very prejudiced idea of what rabbis were like. And he brought me into another office and he introduced me to this incredibly young, vital guy named Arthur Gilbert. And I said, with a brand new department just opening up called the Department of Interreligious Cooperation. And I asked him to describe what the work was about. And he said, it's trying to establish a dialogic relationship with various church groups, with the Christian community, to get them to understand Judaism a little better, to take responsibility for negative and hostile attitudes that have no basis in reality or fact, and to establish an ongoing dialogue. So I said, boy, it sounds like wonderful work, but it's not for me. So he said, why not? I said, I have no experience in that field. And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, my dear young lady, in 1955, I was a young lady. He said, my dear young lady, there is no field. And in point of fact, there was no field. Now there's a field. Now there are advanced degrees in Christian-Jewish relations. Now there are centers in a variety of academic institutions. So now there's a field. And what happened was, because I came in that early, I helped to define and establish the field. I came in without ecclesiastical credentials, you know. I was not a rabbi. There were no women rabbis in 1955. And no academic credentials, you know. I only had a BA. But I had I was right for the field, and I was right for dialogue. And I don't know what I had, except maybe an open mind and an open heart and a tremendous curiosity, you know, about the beliefs of other people. And so in a sense, you know, I helped establish this field. I came in totally unprepared, but you know, and I was 5 years at ADL, and then I went to the American Jewish Committee. I actually got there a year and a half before Mark Tannenbaum came, but the AJC was already involved in creating background material for the Second Vatican Council. And we got, through Mark, we also established a relationship with Cardinal Bea. And Bea welcomed scholarly information about the relationship between Christians and Jews, and how Christians or Catholics portray Jews in their teaching materials and their preaching. And so the AJC eventually, even a year before the council convened, we sent 3 memos to the Second Vatican Council. The first one was called The Image of the Jews in Catholic Teaching. And that was a distillation and, you know, simplification and interpretation of Sister Rose Thierink's self-studies of Catholic textbooks. And I wrote that document. The second one was called Anti-Jewish Elements in the Liturgy. And that was written for us by a liturgist at Hebrew Union College. And it had to do with you know, around the Triduum, around Easter, around Good Friday, the readings and stuff. And the third one was a memo by Abraham Joshua Heschel, whom Mark had brought into the movement, into the process by sending Heschel. He had been a student of Heschel's at Jewish Theological Seminary, and they had a personal and a warm relationship. And Mark recognized, he said he's a little guy, but he's a monumental voice in American Judaism, and as a matter of fact, in international Judaism. And he sent Heschel over to Rome, and they met with Bea, and they two struck it off. They were both biblical scholars, you know. And so Heschel agreed to represent AJC's interests and positions that got involved, and he wrote the third memo, which dealt with what practical measures the church could actually do to open up and encourage the relationship with Jews and Judaism. As, for example, establishing some permanent office at the Vatican that would deal with relationship with Jews. You know, the only effective office that dealt with Jews was how to convert them, you know, and also to examine their materials, etc., to open up a dialogue, the cooperation on civic and communal issues of concern to both. And I wrote the first memo. I edited the second one. Nobody edits Abraham Joshua Heschel. He sent that off by himself. Right. And I worked very closely with Mark for about 25 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. John, do you have any comments before we turn to the class for some discussion?
No. Why don't we go to discussion?
So I sent both of you some questions that
Right.
the class sent. There's no right way to do this. If there are some questions that strike you that you feel like addressing, that's a great way to start. I know that there are some students who didn't send me questions but still might want to ask something now. So why don't we start by asking you, was there a question that among those that I sent that you thought maybe you'd want to address, or two?
Well, let me just give a little bit of the history and the issues. I'm sure you probably have taken the class through some of the history, and that in a sense there was no, in the initial preliminary agenda for the Second Vatican Council, there was nothing on interreligious relations or specifically Catholic-Jewish relations. However, it became possible at one point for a noted French Jewish historian, Jules Isaac, who had already written on anti-Semitism particularly in Catholic teaching materials in France, to pay a visit to Pope John the 23rd. And during the visit, Isaac said to the Pope that there was need for the Catholic Church and the Council to address the issue of traditional Catholic anti-Semitism and so on, especially in the light of what had happened not too long before that during the Holocaust in Germany. The Pope John did not give an immediate reply, but said he'd think about it. A few days later, he asked Cardinal Bea to begin working on a text that would cover Catholic-Jewish relations. That text was not actually introduced into the council until the second session. There was opposition to it. There was opposition to it from some of the very conservative elements of the council. There was some opposition to it from bishops whose sees were in Muslim majority countries and where the Catholic Christian community was a small minority, and who feared going back to their home dioceses with a document exclusively on the Jews. That was one of the reasons why the document was eventually expanded to a wider document on interreligious relations, even though Chapter 4 is the most developed of the part of Nostra Aetate and really was the central focus of the document. Subsequently, other parts of the document have assumed a new importance. The issues, when one of the earliest Jewish participants in the dialogue, Rabbi Henry Siegman, who then was the director of something called the American Jewish Congress, he was famously quoted as saying one time, Jews only have one goal for the dialogue, and that's to get Christians off our back. Well, I think Catholic Christians, I would say, had three goals for the for the dialogue. The first was to confront the ugly and centuries-long tradition of Catholic and wider Christian anti-Semitism, which some have described through terminology like this anti-Semitism being a shadow on the cross, or as Rosemary Ruther put it in her groundbreaking book on this subject, that Christology was the left hand of anti-Judaism. So there had been, we began to realize that the very brief statements of chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate, which argued, number one, that Jews didn't kill Jesus Christ as a community. Secondly, that because they didn't kill him, they could not be said to have lost membership in the original covenant with God. And thirdly, that Jesus was very, very positively inclined towards certain parts of the Jewish tradition of his time, and especially in a special way, what was happening in the rather revolutionary approach to Judaism advocated by a group known as the Pharisees. I think many of us have heard the poor Pharisees denounced, particularly in preaching, without understanding who they were, the complexity of that movement, and how Jesus really, as the 1985 Vatican document commemorating the 20th anniversary of Nostra Aetate put it, Jesus was closer to the Pharisees than to any other Jewish movement of the time in his own preaching and teaching. So these issues of how Christianity, Catholic Christianity, might respond to the strong affirmation in Nostra Aetate that in fact Jews remained in the covenant and were not replaced there by the church, and therefore relegated to a declining role in human history. That was, if you look at some of the earlier pre-Vatican II, even biblical writings, there was a strong motif arguing that Judaism once was a great religion. It contributed to Christianity. However, Christianity took over what was good in Judaism and discarded what was bad, and that Jews were really to kind of fade away into history eventually, replaced there by Christianity. Now, that kind of mindset was further enhanced by the church fathers, who argued, particularly St. Augustine, who argued that Jews should be killed or murdered, but that they should be relegated to a very marginal marginal role in human society, so that they could demonstrate by their rejection from the covenant what happens to people who do not accept Jesus as the Messiah. And so that negative view of Jews and Judaism persisted for centuries and was the cause, as the late Father Edward Flannery, who wrote the first groundbreaking book, in a way, on the subject of Catholic anti-Semitism, titled The Anguish of the Jews, Father Flannery estimated that in the course of so-called Christian history, the number of Jews who died because of Christian anti-Semitism was perhaps approached some 1 million people. And we see another interesting place to study this question is actually the history of Christian art. And one of the most famous images is the image on the facade of the Catholic Cathedral in Strasbourg, France. I had the opportunity one time to lecture in Strasbourg, and so I took an official tour of the cathedral, wondering what the guide was going to tell us about the big facade on the side, outer side of the cathedral. And I thought he might just skip it and not say anything. However, this facade was very common in many parts of Europe at the time. It depicted Judaism and Christianity as two women. Judaism was depicted as a blindfolded, bent over a woman holding a broken Torah. The Catholic tradition, or the Christian tradition, was portrayed by a bright, vivacious young woman holding the Gospels. So this contrast of Judaism as an old, worn-out religious tradition that was taken over in its better sides by the Christian tradition was very, very strongly implanted in Christian consciousness. And St. Augustine and many of the other church fathers contributed to the planting of these really anti-Judaic and potentially anti-Semitic seeds in the self-identity of the Christian community. There were exceptions, but they were not very numerous. And certainly this was not the same as Nazi racial anti-Semitism, although Nazi racial anti-Semitism picked up on this tradition. And for many people at the grassroots who didn't really understand all of the musings and philosophy articulated by Adolf Hitler and his compatriots, this traditional Christian anti-Semitism was the reason why they either actively supported or at least were silent in the face of the rise of Nazism. As Adolf Hitler said to two bishops who visited him in the early days of his movement in Germany, he said, well, I'm just doing what you people prophesied and have preached in terms of the Jewish community. So, I mean, we bear a real legacy there. And the first aim really for me as someone being involved in dialogue, and for many of my colleagues from the Catholic side involved in dialogue, was the removal of the stain of anti-Semitism. The second one was to pick up on the sort of third aspect of Nostra Aetate, namely that Judaism had a very constructive influence on the teachings of Jesus, in particularly Pharisaic Judaism, and then that had to be restored. That, in a sense, in the renewal of Catholic Christianity espoused by the Second Vatican Council, understanding Jesus's positive relationships with Jewish tradition of the time. What was a rabbi, understanding each human person as a child of God, and so on. Those were very important concepts for Pharisaic Judaism, which influenced the shape of Jesus's movement, which I think in some ways a Second Vatican Council was trying to restore. And thirdly, I think the third aim of the dialogue was collaboration on important issues of justice and peace in human society throughout the world. Actually, the first relationships between Jews and Christians, particularly Catholic Christians, occurred in the area of social justice and the area particularly of worker rights in this country. The late Monsignor John A. Ryan, who helped establish what is now the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, but was then called the National Catholic Welfare Conference, organized a trilateral body of support from the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities for the social reforms associated with the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that brought this country out of the Depression. Ryan was rewarded for his support by President Roosevelt by being twice named to give the invocation at two of Franklin Roosevelt's inaugurals. But this process also enabled Catholics and Jews to bond in a effort in places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and elsewhere on behalf of the workers who were being exploited in plants and so on. And as one writer put it, a lot of the very early Catholic Jewish dialogue took place in local prison cells in New York and elsewhere among Jewish and Catholic activists for worker rights. It was only later that we really entered a more theological oriented dialogue. So I think that's important. And we do have the responsibility of trying to finally free ourselves from this so-called displacement theology of Judaism, which originated really in the beginnings of the first century, but especially in the patristic period, and replace it with something else that is more constructive and more one that underscores the continued Jewish covenantal inclusion after the coming of Christ. How we express that is still something that presents a challenge that has not been adequately addressed. Probably the most singular change that has occurred in our understanding of the Christian-Jewish relationship has come through biblical scholarship, where there's been a tremendous amount of new studies on the relationship between so-called Jews and Christians in the first centuries. And we know now that the split, the break between Judaism and Christianity continued well after the first century, and some places, particularly in Eastern Christianity, as late as the 5th century, where we know, for example, at Antioch, St. John Chrysostom, who was notorious for his anti-Jewish sermons in Antioch, probably preached those sermons against Jews and Judaism because a lot of his congregants continued to attend Jewish worship services. They still felt somehow linked in an official way to the Jewish community. And from the other side, there's no evidence that they had a hard time getting into these worship services, that the Jews tried to keep them out. We don't know exactly how they functioned at that time. Perhaps some shepherd will find some additional manuscripts in some cave in the area. But beyond that, we just simply have to say that there was still a sense for several centuries of a link between Judaism and Christianity, and we need to explore that more. However, this biblical research, unfortunately, has not yet taken much of a hold in what I would call the area of systematic theology or in the area of Christian Catholic liturgy. So I'll leave that there, because someone asked me about the theology. So I'll say, yes, we need a new theology, but we've jettisoned the old one, but we really haven't come to a replacement that has garnered widespread consensus.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering now whether anyone has a follow-up question for Father Pawlikowski, or whether we can bring Ms. Banki back into the conversation. So I want to open it up to students at this point. You can unmute yourselves if you have a question, or you can raise your hand using the, gosh, I don't know how to do this. You know how to raise your hands. So if you have any questions, otherwise, I can pull up the questions that have been sent in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody have a question based on what Father Pawlikowski just said? Juan is thinking very deeply.
It's mainly perhaps the relationship of the Catholics and Jews here in the United States. Perhaps it's more like history and social question. The Catholics in the United States was in the minority in the middle of the 1960, 17, something like that. And I wonder if that being a minority in the United States, that was something, I wonder if that was allow the group, especially the Jews and the Catholics, to work together and feel identified themselves, that were to work together here in the USA. Perhaps that was kind of like I was asking myself that question. And for Father John, if he can say something more about that.
Yeah, Judith Banki may have something to add to this too. I would go back in a sense to the comment I made about Rabbi Siegman and his, that the function of dialogue for Jews is to get Christians off their back. But, I think a minority always feels that they have to protect themselves against the power of the majority. And I think Jews were no exception in this regard. While Catholics were often felt that they were closed off from national political positions in the United States. You remember the battle, some of you may remember the battle over the president, when John Kennedy, well, first of all, when the first Catholic was nominated for the presidency, of course, didn't win. But when John Kennedy was nominated by the Democratic Party in 1960, he got to give a famous speech in Houston, Texas, saying how his administration would not let the Vatican take over the White House. I mean, there was almost a kind of exaggerated fear that if you had a Catholic president, the Pope would come sailing down the Potomac and take over the White House. So Catholics felt themselves nationally as a minority. However, in many of the major metropolitan areas, such as New York, Boston, Chicago, Catholics were a strong presence. Now, it's interesting to contrast that. One of the interesting studies that has been done, and I had some personal experience there, is how Jews and Catholic Christians related over the years in Atlanta, Georgia. Because in Atlanta, Georgia, Catholics were very definitely a minority. Evangelical Christians and even mainline Christians really dominated the scene. So Catholics and Jews in places like Atlanta had a kind of instinctive understanding of what it meant to be a minority, in the way that Catholics living in Boston, Chicago, and New York didn't appreciate. Although, if you went back to the 1920s, 30s, it was quite commonplace in newspapers to see advertisements, say, for apartments or for jobs. And they, in the advertisement, it was stated, neither Jews nor Catholics need apply. So there was a sense of this kind of sharing in minority status, which often had negative consequences for both Jews and Catholics. Judi, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting. There was a lot of cooperation in the labor movement. Mm-hmm. The triangle, the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which women, these young immigrant women were trapped all the exit doors were locked, and many were killed in the fire. But if you look at the names, they were Jewish or they were Italian Catholic. That's who died in the fire. So there was, but it was a very schizophrenic relationship, because on the one hand, they both were minorities, and there was that sort of brotherhood or sisterhood feeling of being discriminated against. On the other hand, there was also, I know, I grew up, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, and in Brooklyn, if you were Catholic, you didn't say what neighborhood you were in, you said what parish you belonged to. And I lived right across the street from a Roman Catholic church, and I must say I was never bothered, but my brother was accosted on Good Friday, and by a group of young Catholic kids who said they accused him of killing their God, So the Christ killer legend was very strong and very powerful among not very educated Catholic kids, or maybe they were just educated the wrong way. As a matter of fact, there's a whole line of Jewish Black humor, underground humor about this. And it was just, lots of little one-line jokes where a Jew is accosted on the street and said, "Your people killed my Lord." He said, "The Goldbergs had nothing to do with it." Jewish anxiety very often resolves in jokes, and as Mel Brooks can tell you, or Woody Allen. So there was this very schizophrenic relationship. There was a lot of cooperation in terms of labor, but there was still, a lot of religious more than ethnic prejudice against Jews in the Roman Catholic Church. And I think Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council dealt with the sources of that very effectively. It's a question of, how well it's been implemented. I saw some statistics recently that said that's still something like, it's under 10%, like 7 or 8% of Roman Catholics in the United States still believe that the Jews killed Christ. So what I'm saying is, if that's the case, then in the parish, they're not teaching the kids very well. There's a failure of education in the church there, because certainly the groundwork for doing away with that accusation is there, and it's been adapted at the highest levels of the church.
Thank you for
I
your
might
answer.
just give a little vignette from my own childhood. I grew up in a neighborhood that had a substantive Jewish population, mostly Orthodox, from Eastern and Central Europe. There was a huge synagogue just about a block from my house. And on the corner, on the street where I lived, there was one of these mom and pop grocery stores that had a soda fountain. And a number of us, after classes at different places, at the Lutheran school, at the public school across the street, at the Catholic parish school, would often gather there to buy a Coke or something, or an ice cream bar, and so on. And while we were in the store, I had established a kind of familiar relationship with a young Jewish boy who came in regularly, my own age. Strangely, we never exchanged names, but we would chat and so on, and had a very kind of positive outlook towards each other. But I always noticed when we stepped outside of the store, it was like he never knew me. He really suddenly kept his distance from me. And I kind of wondered, I really never thought about it all that much, but later on I think I could understand it. He was afraid of being seen fraternizing with Goy, as Jews, particularly if they were trying to be angry towards Catholics, would call us. So that just kind of eventually brought home to me, the kind of negative attitudes that persisted in both communities. I mean, I would say that the reason negative views of Catholics and generally of Christians persisted in the Jewish community were due to the whole long history of Christian anti-Semitism and the kind of incidents multiplied thousands of times that Judi Banki just described relative to your brother, I think you said, who were beaten up. And it was even worse because Good Friday became a time of great fear and dread in many European cities because Christians would go to services, and then as soon as the service was over, they would leave the church and go into the Jewish quarter, and in many cases kill Jews, saying, Christ killer and so on. So you could understand why Jews acquired a kind of negative outlook towards Christians generally, and were very much afraid of Jewish Christian interaction. I was thinking maybe I might pick up on one other question that's here on the sheet you sent me, and that is the issue of missionizing. This remains still a very, very difficult issue for many to deal with. And again, it goes back to Rabbi Siegmund's statement, we want to get Christians off our back. And many Jews still feel that they're always threatened in their existence by efforts of Christian preachers and Christian missionaries to the Jews. Now, in reality, in the United States in particular, the Catholic community has not engaged in wholesale efforts to convert Jews. That's largely been an evangelical task, if you want. Although in Europe, there's still some important Christian communities, again, not so much Catholic, but say even within the Anglican Church in Great Britain, there is still a formal office for the conversion of Jews. It's not funded much, it doesn't get much visibility, but it hasn't completely vanished. So, and I've been part, as some of my Christian colleagues have, of signing statements, declarations against missionizing Jews. Now, I think we have to allow freedom of conscience, and if somebody in the Jewish community wants to convert to Christianity, I don't think we can try to stop them. I myself, in a sense, could be considered a failure because one of my I'm trying to think of the word. I was the sponsor at a baptism for one of my cousin's daughters, and she eventually went to Israel and became Jewish. So I suppose for my terms of my role as a godfather, as we call it, I would be considered a failure. But I think we have to allow for private movement in that sense. But I think we really, I think, have to oppose any kind of organized proselytizing, missionizing of the Jews. Now, that was not something that's still an officially declared teaching of the Catholic Church. And I dare say, if you would put that question to even most bishops today, and perhaps even to Pope Francis or even to Pope John Paul II, who wrote more positively on Catholic-Jewish relations than any other pope in history, that if you really pressed them against the wall on this issue, they would say, yes, we still have an obligation to convert Jews. Now, many in the evangelical Christian community would say, well, we can refrain from trying to convert Jews, because really the conversion involves extending to them the love of Christ, and we wouldn't want to deprive them of the love of Christ. Well, for most Jews, they are quite willing to not have that or to accept that deprivation. There have been exploratory ways of saying that in fact Christians and Jews share a kind of covenantal bonding, but that they approach this covenantal bonding in different ways. Some would actually speak of two covenants. Someone, I think, raised that in the questions as well. That there is, there's a special covenant for Christianity and a special covenant for Jews. Both, I would say definitely Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, rejected that view. And I would say that most bishops and officials of the Vatican and so on would not embrace two covenant theory of the Jewish-Christian relationship. However, what some have done, and particularly Cardinal Walter Kasper, when he was head of the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with Jews, he pursued and helped to organize a group of Christian theologians to pursue this issue of how do we theologically understand this relationship in a way that does not necessarily lead to a notion of the need for proselytizing Jews. And he clearly said that if a Jewish person remains faithful to their covenantal obligations, they would attain final salvation alongside of Christians or Catholic Christians. And his attitude was sort of, well, how this is reconciled in the end, we'll leave that up to God. But in the meantime, in a sense, Christians and Jews are walking on connected parallel paths towards a kind of final, perhaps, reconciliation in the end time. So it's a much more of a eschatological perspective on the Christian-Jewish relationship. The Jews aren't as what you call theological generally as Christians. They're more attuned to good deeds and so on. That doesn't mean they don't have people who qualify as scholars of the tradition and so on, even in the theological and philosophical areas. But they're not so intent on that. The average Jewish person would not be as insistent on so-called dogma as some Catholics would. So there can basically, many of them really, because of the history too, and you always have to take into account the history of the relationship and to understand contemporary perspectives. Many Jews today are very, very negligent even of these kind of positive attempts to both acknowledge a separate existence and covenantal relationship for Jews, but still somehow connected to Christianity, connected with Christianity, they're uneasy with this because it seems to remove or mitigate their own self-identity. And so they would prefer something like a double covenant theory, saying, yes, we have common roots. Our covenantal relationships emerge from some similar experiences, biblical and post-biblical, but basically we're two separate communities. This was raised during the pontificate of John Paul II, because John Paul made some quite strong statements about the Jewish-Christian relationship, in which he argued that when you look at the heart of Christianity, there you find Judaism. Not all, well, we might think of that in a very positive way today, that kind of statement. It made some Jews, even Jews involved in dialogue with Christians, such as Irving Greenberg, rather uncomfortable, because it seemed to, there is a sense in which Jews want to maintain a wall of separation between the two traditions. We haven't resolved the mission. It's not really pursued organizationally in the Catholic Church, but we haven't really, to the chagrin of a number of us working in Catholic-Jewish relations, we haven't really formally renounced it. I think on an official level, Cardinal Cosper came as close as anybody to relegating that notion to, if you want, to the dustbin of history.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please, Judy. And also, I want to make sure that I know we're nearing the end of our time, but if anyone has a question specifically for you, Judy, as well, we'll make time for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to, add a few words to what John said. And it says, I really feel for Christians, because they have this dilemma, that Jesus said, it's by me, only by me do you enter. I mean, the feeling that you have to be baptized, you have to be a Christian to find, to be saved. And I mean, Jews don't have that problem. Theologically, they don't have that problem because Jews never thought that they had a corner on salvation. And one of the fundamental statements of Judaism, which is as close to theology as we get, is that the righteous of all nations shall have a share in the world to come. So it's you're saved in a sense by your behavior, not by your belief. But we haven't had the time to talk about it, but there was from within the Orthodox community a great deal of resistance to getting engaged in this whole process around the pressing for Nostra Aetate. And there was a certain cynicism, and what they said was that they're really only interested in converting you, and now they're trying to do with honey instead of forced sermons and inquisitions. And during the course of the Second Vatican Council, there were various versions of Nostra Aetate, and one of them indeed was conversionist in essence, so hoping that Jews will find the truth or something. And that even turned off Heschel. I'm not sure he ever fully recovered confidence after that. He described it, a wonderful phrase, as spiritual fratricide. And the Orthodox see, we knew it all along. It's all they really want to do is to convert us. So it's a very touchy issue, and the reason it's a touchy issue is that historically, it was accompanied with force. It was accompanied with humiliation and worse, a persecution of Jews. I mean, the Rome ghetto, if you've been to Rome, you've seen the ghetto is sort of behind what is the main synagogue. And there was a wall up on the ghetto where the church placed statements from the Hebrew scriptures describing the Jews as stiff-necked people, which is what God calls us. Well, we are. We argue with God, and we argue with our prophets, and we argue with one another, and that is our way of seeking truth. It's of discovering truth. I mean, I really don't have time, but the whole Talmudic way of learning, which is pitting two people against one another, or two points of view against one another, both of which may find validity, within the tradition. So, but to sum it up in one sentence, and it was Father Ed Flannery, who was a good old Irish Catholic priest who got the first position right after Vatican Council, when a position was created in the American Church for relationship with Catholic-Jewish relations in the U.S. And it was occupied by Father Flannery. I think he was the first Roman Catholic priest also to write a book on anti-Semitism. But it's a famous statement. He said, "Catholics have torn from their history books the pages that Jews have memorized." And that was the essence, and that was what came out of the studies, is Catholics do not teach this to their students. And it's something that Jews learn, or that they know intuitively. A history of persecution, a history of forced sermons. Jews had to go in Rome, they had to go in and listen to sermons in the church. And the violence was just as much from the Eastern Orthodox and the Protestant, some of the Lutherans, as it was from the Roman Catholic Church. But what resulted from that was really profound distrust of the motives of Christians making nice to Jews. And I would say that's changed enormously in the last 50 years. And another thing that's changed, which is very interesting, is that there have always been Christian scholars of the quote of the Old Testament, because it's part of the Christian scripture. So there have always been Christians commenting and analyzing the Old Testament, and pointing out why it's inferior to the New Testament, and how every foretelling of on that day of what's going to happen has been fulfilled in Jesus, etc. But what is new, and it's within my working lifetime, is Jewish scholars of the New Testament. And quite remarkably, some of them outstanding ones are women. And that's added a new dimension to the discussion, I think probably many of you, I know the faculty is familiar with the work of A.J. Levine, but she occupies a very unique situation at Vanderbilt. She's both director of Jewish studies, and she's a teacher of New Testament in the Divinity School, and she has, and she very much makes the argument of Jesus as a Jew, that he fits all the definitions, that early Christianity has to be understood through the eyes of Jews. I mean, it's an interesting dimension that's been added to the conversation. It's not entirely convincing. But I have to make one cynical observation before we end. Do I have time? Hello?
Sorry, I was on mute. Do not rush. Don't rush on our account.
Okay.
We have all the time in the world. It depends on when you are done.
Okay.
We are not rushed.
I just want to point out something very interesting. When I came into the program, when I came into the field, and I think it was Spellman who was cardinal at that time in New York. Secular priests, priests of the diocese, were not allowed to share a podium with clergymen of other faiths, because it would give the impression that other faiths had equal validity. If we wanted to have a program in which Catholics and Jews clergymen spoke together, we would have to import some Jesuits from New Jersey, because it was prohibited for secular priests, not necessarily for members of orders, but for secular priests to share a platform with clergy of other religious faiths. Now, the same thing is going on today, where Pope Francis is being criticized by the old guard in his church for sharing a platform with non-Christians, including Muslims, in a search for peace and health and sanity, et cetera, et cetera. He's being criticized for sharing a platform, sharing a public platform with infidels. And so, it's a cycle. History repeats itself. There are some problems that eventually, look, he's still the Pope. They haven't knocked him out of office. And it's probably a minority, within the church doing that kind of criticism. But it shows you that some of the problems are very, very deeply rooted, and some of the attitudes are very deeply rooted, including in my own community. There's still a distrust of the dialogue in the Orthodox community. I remember speaking once with the president. It's a lay position. It's not a rabbinical position. The president of the Jewish communities of Italy, a former journalist, a very wonderful woman named Tulia Zevi. And she said to me once, we were in Rome to welcome them when we came. We were in Rome before the Christians showed up. We waved to them on the streets, and look what they did to us. They forced us into ghettos. They persecuted us. They discriminated against us. The sense of outrage. And she was a woman, by the way, who was open to dialogue and in favor of what AG was doing at the Vatican Council. A lot of people were opposed to it. But what I'm saying is the memory is very deep. The historic memory goes very deep.
Judi, can I ask you about the picture in the background? Is that you with Pope John Paul II?
Oh my gosh, can you see it? Yes.
Can you tell us about that picture?
Yeah, that was very interesting. It's when the ICCJ met in Rome. I don't remember the year, but
93? Was that in?
I guess it was 93 when the ICCJ met in Rome, and as part of the deal was that the ICCJ was allowed to present, in other words, that there was this open public, huge, right in St. Peter's Square, and then there was a little platform where people who were privileged enough to be invited could be introduced to the Pope. So, of course, the patron of the ICCJ at the time was Sir Sigmund Sternberg, and he put the big shots, the board members, the famous people who were at the conference. I was not among them, and I didn't expect to be among them, and I didn't expect to be introduced to the Pope. But after that was over, Remy Huckman, Father Remy Huckman, who was the secretary of of the Secretariat for Catholic-Jewish Relations, and with whom I had worked very closely on many occasions. Remy Huckman took the Pope by the arm and brought him over to meet me. And he said, I want you to meet the person who drafted your response when you spoke to the Jewish community in Florida, who drafted the Jewish response.
Can you move your screen just a little so we can see the Pope again? Because I saw him at the beginning, but now it's out of the frame.
Okay, hold on.
Thank you. Wow.
So he brought me over, the Pope and I.
That's great.
I was a bit younger then, that's me, and guess who that is?
That's great.
And the woman was one of the Protestant observers, I think, at the ICCJ. ICCJ is not Catholic Jewish; it's Catholic Protestant Jewish, and it was also one of the first organizations that realized that they had to reach out to the Muslim world, but they didn't want to change the title of the organization, so they created a separate organization called the Abrahamic Forum, which is tri-faith and always has been tri-faith. And the Abrahamic Forum meets together with the ICCJ. My phone is ringing.
Do you need to get it?
Excuse me?
Do you need to get it?
Well, yeah, let somebody else talk.
Okay, okay. John, do you have anything you want to add? I think we're going to wrap up soon.
Well, I just pick up a little bit on Judy's mention of the developments in recent years in Judaism, particularly on the theological front and the scriptural front. It's still a very small number of Jewish scholars, but there is an increasing number of Jewish scholars who are really exploring the relationship in a very positive way between Jews and Christians in the first centuries, but also seeing a reality of what some of them had described as incarnationalism in Judaism. Now, some other scholars have warned the scholars that use that term that they're fudging the difference between what the Jewish tradition might understand as incarnationalism and what Christians understand by under the Christology of the incarnation. But there is a willingness now to at least entertain some of that. And to, for example, there's a scholar, and he's quite controversial in many areas, but Daniel Boyarin at University of California, Berkeley, in the Jewish Studies Department. And he has written, for example, that what we call in Christianity Christology was really a job, as he puts it, a job description in Judaism that was not written for Jesus, but was out there and Jesus picked it up. Now, I would dare say that most Jewish scholars would not be comfortable with that kind of description, but we're seeing a little bit more of it. Other Jewish scholars have written books on the so-called incarnationalism, particularly in parts of more the Jewish mystical tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully Judy's going to join us. Okay. I know we're a little bit past time. Everything okay?
Yeah, well, the point is, I'm stuck. I'm quarantined at home. So if people call me and I don't pick up the phone, they get nervous. They think something may have happened to me.
It's good that you picked up.
Yeah, well, I'll track down the number and call it back afterwards.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm trying to think about how to wrap up. First of all, thank you both so much. I'm wondering whether each of you have a few final comments to make, or whether you have time for one question from the class. But if not, it's completely
Yeah, of course. I have time.
Yeah, I have.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your generosity. I just want to make sure that the students, you know, if there's anything that they didn't understand, or have a question that we haven't addressed yet. Let's see here. Anybody? Any question? You could take yourself off of mute. Oh, Joshua.
Yes, hi, yeah. My question is for either of you. Thank you first for joining us. I'm just curious, we've talked about this several times throughout this class, but sort of an issue that we're seeing today of, I guess my question is, do either of you perceive a sense of rising anti-Semitism, particularly in the West, in North America? I'm just wondering if you've perceived this sort of challenge, and what you think about it. Is it there, and what are some ways we can address it? Thank you.
Well, let me start there. Yes, very definitely. There has been a real upsurge in anti-Semitism. Some of it is related to the current COVID virus crisis, and then most of it is being done on the internet. Though also, I mean, we saw some of the demonstrations connected with COVID, and even the earlier ones of neo-Nazis marching and so on. I mean, the neo-Nazis, when they marched there in Virginia, they walked around the synagogue. It was a Saturday, so services were going on, and their line was, "We will replace you." If you look at the internet right now, there are all sorts of accusations, both against Jews and against Asians, regarding the origins of the COVID crisis. And many of those attacks on the Jews as somehow responsible for the COVID crisis pick up on very classical ancient stereotypes of Jews and Judaism. About the killing of non-Jews, where there was a whole tradition that Christians would kill young Jews for their blood, or that Jews would kill young Christians for their blood, and then use that blood in the baking of matzah and so on. So those kinds of accusations, but that's something we have to be extremely concerned about and attack very, very clearly. John Paul II, in his book Crossing the Threshold, defined anti-Semitism as a sin, and that's about as strong and a statement that I think is possible religiously in Christianity to make. So it is a continuing problem in our society, and we've seen the attacks on Jewish institutions and so on. So it's got a contemporary version. Unfortunately, this longest hatred, as some again have called it, has not vanished, and the COVID crisis has, for one, brought it to the surface again. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I concur with John. I mean, I think I read an ADL thing yesterday that said there were more anti-Semitic incidents this past year than at any time measured. And there have been, incidents that killed people, the attacks in Poway and in Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. We are, as a country and as a world, we are prone to accept conspiracy theories. And, during the Spanish flu, the same kinds of theories surfaced that during the Black Plague, during the Black Plague, which destroyed millions in Europe. The idea that the Jews caused it, that the Jews poisoned the wells. You look for a target, you look for a minority, you look for an explanation, and you look for a target that about whom almost anything could be believed because the minds of people have been poisoned against them. And I would say, there's a huge upsurge in anti-Semitism. And the big difference, it's a big difference for me, is that this time the church is on our side. I mean, Roman Catholic bishops have been condemning the anti-Semitic outbreaks. I mean, there's been a gathering. I find it very touching. Where was it? Was it in Montana somewhere where somebody threw a stone through the window of a Jewish family because they had a menorah, a Hanukkah menorah in the window. And what the local people did in response to that was they cut out menorahs, the silhouette of a menorah, and put them in their windows. Local citizens, non-Jews, Christians, Catholics and Protestants. And, this kind of identification, I think we need it because there's always a tendency to single out a target to blame for the disasters that are going on. And look, it's not an easy time. I'm stuck. I'm in the epicenter here in New York, and I'm stuck at home 24 hours a day. You go a little batty.
That was Billings, Montana, by the way. Something similar occurred in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, too, where the Christian community stood up against the neo-Nazis' attempt to take over the town. And while they didn't put menorahs in the window, they took a hard stand. And in fact, the pastor of the Catholic Church really suffered a nervous breakdown as a result of the protests, and his own church was set on fire. So this kind of social ugliness, unfortunately, is still there in American society, and a lot of it has to do with anti-Semitism.
Well, I think we're going to break here. I cannot thank you both enough for taking the time to join us, and more than that, for everything that you've done for devoting your life's work to this reconciliation. It's hard. I know it can be thankless, but I also know the impact is infinitely reaching, and we want to thank you so much.
Let me just say, being involved has been one of the most transforming experiences of my life.
Yeah, I have to say also, I am so lucky. I could have been in advertising, I could have ended up not working in this field. And I consider myself very blessed that I was able to get into it, because I have met the most wonderful people, and I've had a chance to sharpen my own whatever skills I have. And sometimes it's discouraging. You see the same patterns repeating, but you now have allies where you once had enemies, and that's something to it's a good feeling when you're at the end of your life, I'm not rushing death. I'm not in a hurry, but I'm approaching the age at which no one in my family has ever gone beyond, and to have a sense that I had the blessing of being involved in this wonderful, wonderful movement with wonderful, wonderful people. But I'm full of gratitude. And thanks for asking. Thanks for asking us.
Yes.
We're full of gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so very much again. I don't want to be too corny, but if my students can come off of mute to say thank you and maybe give a little applause and
Thank you so much.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Your voices.
Yeah.
You could hear
Thank
them.
you, and greetings from
Thank you.
Indonesia for both of you.
Yeah.
We have 2 students here from Indonesia. We have students from all over the world.
El Salvador.
Well, I only have one kid, and my only kid and my grandchildren live in Australia. So, you know, I told her
Wow.
if she was any further away, she'd be off the planet.
You have spiritual children.
Huh?
You have many spiritual children.
Yeah. Oh,
Many.
That's,
More than
that's
you'll
good to
know.
know. Good to know. Okay.
And you don't have to buy them presents.
Yeah,
Thank
presents
you,
today
thank
is
you.
a
Just
beautiful
sit in
present.
classrooms and me.
Well,
How's your health? Okay.
Who are you?
Okay.
You asking me?
Yes. You're looking.
It's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
all right. Well, I'll let you both go. Thank you so much again. I'm going to be in touch with you because this is recorded, and I think it's an incredible conversation that maybe we could think about sharing with others if the students are okay with it. So you will hear from me. And again, many thanks to you.
John and I will go on the road together.
You should.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for having us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Peace.
Bye.
Peace.
Thanks. John, you're welcome to stick around, but I think I'm going to give my students a break, and then we're going to talk a little bit, and then they'll take their final.
Well, I have to have another
Okay.
commitment, so. Oh, okay, I'm not quite sure how to, it's not my computer I'm using. So, I'll leave it on for now. I have to get the person.
You could press stop video and mute at the bottom left. You want to do that?
Bottom left.
See mute and stop video, just click those 2, yeah. That's okay. You know what? Don't worry about it.
Yeah, okay. We'll shut it off, right?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually can do it. There we go. Wow. Okay, so that was amazing. Incredible. I'm going to stop recording. Hold on one second.